It's probably by the time I read mine and hers. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. The hearing is entitled Promoting Economic Growth, Exploring the Impact of Recent Trade Policies on the U.S. Economy. I now recognize myself for a 5-minute opening statement. Thank you for all being here today and for your shared focus on the crisis in which we find ourselves. Our country has entered day 512 of what can only be described as a trade war. The opening salvo came when the president's tariffs targeting solar panels and washing machines took place. As our witnesses will attest, it has cascaded into nearly $400 billion worth of traded goods and has triggered retaliation from countries including China, India, Canada, Mexico, and even members of the European Union. The trade war has impacted nearly every facet of our economy, from agriculture to manufacturing. While I know and have read the works of many of you who are kind enough to lend your time to us today, I have one person who is not only a witness but a constituent. I've heard from Ronnie Russell and a number of other farmers in my 5th District of Missouri, and I will ask him to explain the devastating toll this trade war has had on the lives of those farmers trying to make a living in Missouri. I understand that in response to U.S. actions, American agricultural and food exports to China declined precipitously, largely due to a drop in exports from U.S. soybeans. China has levied retaliatory tariffs on 25% on soybeans, raising the total tariff rate to 27% and effectively restricting access to what was the largest U.S. export market for that crop. About half of all soybeans produced in the United States were exported prior to the application of the tariffs. As the farmers on this panel will attest, there was hardly a place in the world that could compete with us in terms of the exportation of soybeans. Many of the folks that Ronnie Russell and John Boyd are representing here today don't have another few months for the trade war to linger. Their farms are literally on the line. The cost of this trade war is not limited just to my rural communities. It traverses the length of Missouri's I-70 and across all rural and urban divides around this country. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, in his testimony before this committee earlier this year, told us that uncertainty is being injected into manufacturing sentiment due to the trade disputes adversely impacting this sector. This is costing American jobs. Trade partnership worldwide finds that, on net, my home state of Missouri stands to lose over 45,000 jobs as a result of the trade war, and our country could lose over 2 million. There's no American that is insulated from this pain. The Federal Reserve found that U.S. tariffs were almost completely passed through into U.S. domestic prices, so that the entire incidence of the tariffs fell on domestic consumers and importers up to now, with no impact so far on the prices received by foreign exporters. They said that, and I quote, "Producers respond to reduced import competition by raising their prices," unquote. Making it more expensive for Americans to buy the necessities of life, Americans are already struggling with low wages and long hours. These tariffs are taxes that hamper American growth and threaten our future. Projections indicate that these taxes threaten to reduce U.S. GDP by nearly a percentage point. And as we have this morning's hearing, down the hall, my colleagues in the Ways and Means Committee are receiving testimony from the President's leading lieutenant in this war, the U.S. Trade Representative. Down the street, the Commerce Department is entering their 3rd day of testimony from industry groups suffering and crying out for an end to this war. My time is running down. Thank you. The consequences of inaction compel us to have this important conversation and derive solutions to protect our economy and the country. I would ask my colleagues for unanimous consent to enter into the record a discussion draft of a bill that I am working on, and this bill would require the President to conduct thoughtful analysis of the costs to the various segments of the American economy and public before imposing any new tariffs. It would require him to seek advice from a council comprised of cabinet officials to ensure that a decision that could impact every American is more thoughtful than a tweet. With that, I would like to again thank you for lending your voices here this morning. We appreciate it very much to this conversation. I now yield to the ranking member of this subcommittee from Ohio, Mr. Stivers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing. It's a very important topic, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists today. Every member of this committee hears back home about how the trade disputes with China, the European Union, and our North American colleagues are affecting our constituents. We've all heard from constituents and businesses located in our districts about the impact of the trade war. Just last week, I spoke to a gentleman who works for a company called Linden Lumber, and this company sells lumber products into China, which helps reduce our trade deficit with China and employs Americans. But the retaliatory tariffs now threaten the survival of their business, and it's an example that demonstrates the seriousness of the topic that we're discussing today and our importance of finding solutions. Like Mr. Russell, I have a lot of farmers in my district. They're watching their incomes decline, their businesses have impact on supply chains, and that further demonstrates the urgent need to solve these problems. But we also shouldn't oversimplify the issue. I have another constituent company, R.G. Berry, who make slippers, and their slippers can be found all throughout China. The problem is they're not their slippers. They are stolen intellectual property. They steal the slipper, the design, the box, the logo. You wouldn't know it wasn't an R.G. Berry slipper if you bought it, but it's not. They see none of the profits. The intellectual property is stolen from them, and other American companies who operate in China have to agree to share their technology, which potentially seeds their future Chinese competition. And that future Chinese competition can get unlimited backing from the Chinese government, giving it the ability to undercut the pricing of U.S. firms, steal market share, destroy American jobs and industrial capacity. And in particular, in the area of emerging technology, this lost industrial capacity can have significant implications on our military's edge over foreign adversaries. Both sides of the aisle have long recognized these problems with China, yet still they continue. And I'm a free trade Republican. I believe tariffs hurt consumers and they stunt economic growth. So that's why I think it's important we get to a negotiated agreement that puts an end to China's currency manipulation, forced technology transfers, subsidies of state enterprises, and other trade abuses. I also believe that it's in America's long-term national security interest that any trade debate highlights these issues now, because the longer we wait, the worse deal we're going to get. My question I'm looking forward to asking the panel is, if you think these abuses of currency manipulation, forced technology transfer, subsidized industry, and cyber theft are real problems, what are your proposed solutions? Because I do believe we need to get to a negotiated settlement. I look forward to the panel's testimony, particularly your thoughts on China and the USMCA. With that, I'd like to yield my remaining time to the ranking member from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry.
Well, I thank my colleague, and I thank you for your leadership on trade and promoting economic activity, American economic activity globally. And I want to thank Chairman Cleaver for organizing today's hearing. When this hearing was first announced, committee Republicans were puzzled at the title. It was originally called Slowing Economic Growth, the Impact of Recent Trade and Tax Policies on the U.S. Economy. Well, they dropped the word slowing because that's actually inaccurate. We have quite robust growth, especially under this administration. And they dropped the word tax. Well, if you want to talk about growth, I think we should talk about the tax bill that we passed and are now bearing the fruits in the economy. And I think we've got greater growth because of the regulatory relief of this administration and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So nonetheless, I'm encouraged, though, that my Democrat colleagues are interested in trade. I would also encourage them to talk to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, to expedite the consideration of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Act so that NAFTA can be updated and improved for the 21st century. I also think it's important to talk more broadly about the prosperity that the American people are feeling and how every sector in the economy is benefiting from the broad growth that we have. And long-term, we will benefit from a renewed understanding between us and China and our trading relationship. Their economy has changed dramatically, and I think it's really important that we update our relationship with global trading partners, and now is the time. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, the gentleman, the ranking member. Without objection, the chair of the subcommittee yields to the chair of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for such time as she may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Federal Reserve, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank all have forecasted an economic slowdown due primarily to the risk of the president's trade war. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimates that tariffs could cost the average household up to $831 this year, and the Trade Partnership estimates net job losses of 248,399 in California alone. There are legitimate grievances regarding the employment practices in many foreign countries like China, but the president's tactics of provoking a global trade war on unrelated political issues like immigration is reckless. The Congress needs to act to stop the president from further damaging our economy and harming our international relationships. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair of the full committee yields back the balance of her time. Let me take this opportunity to welcome the testimony of our 5 witnesses. Our first witness is Laura Baughman. Ms. Baughman currently serves as the president of the Trade Partnership and Trade Partnership Worldwide. She's previously worked as a senior economist at C&M International, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, Alexander, and Ferdinand, and the National Planning Association. Ms. Baughman, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody.
Your microphone is on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me now? Yes. Good morning. My name is Laura Baughman, and I am president of Trade Partnership and Trade Partnership Worldwide. We prepare studies that assess the economic impacts of trade on U.S. and international economies. I've been asked to talk to you today about some of our research and about the economic impacts of the tariffs that we've been experiencing. I will briefly summarize our research and then describe some ways in which the implementation of the current spate of tariffs and quotas has been affecting companies, in the hope that that information will be helpful to the subcommittee's deliberations on the role that Congress could play in the process. The briefing memo prepared for the subcommittee for this hearing did an excellent job of summarizing the various import restraints that have been imposed since 2018 or contemplated, and how they impact consumers and producers. As the memo notes, the impacts affect nearly every gear in the economic machine. We took a comprehensive look at the potential impacts of various tariff and quota scenarios, assuming those tariffs have been in effect from 1 to 3 years. We used the same model the U.S. International Trade Commission uses to assess the impacts of trade agreements. We found that steel and aluminum Section 232 tariffs plus quotas, tariffs on imports from China on lists 1, 2, and 3, and related retaliation will reduce U.S. GDP annually by 0.3%, raise costs to consumers such that the average family of 4 must shell out $767 more to buy goods, and result in a net loss of nearly 935,000 jobs. Adding in tariffs on imports from China of products on list 4 plus retaliation amplifies the costs. The steel and aluminum restraints and tariffs on all imports from China plus retaliation will reduce U.S. GDP annually by 1%, raise costs to consumers such that the average family of 4 must shell out $2,294 more to buy goods, and result in a net loss of nearly 2,160,000 jobs. In each scenario, while some sectors gain jobs, more lose, so that on balance, the impact is a net negative for U.S. workers nationally and in every state. So you have a copy of our study, which was attached to my written testimony. Our results are consistent with those of other researchers. While scenarios examined and modeling details differ, everyone, including the administration, has concluded that the various tariffs will have a net negative impact on trade, economic growth, and employment. I also thought it would be helpful to summarize some of the principles that have heretofore undergirded trade policy making in the United States and complaints we are hearing, and likely you as well, about the ways the current tariffs are being rolled out in a manner that is inconsistent with those principles. I mentioned 4 in my written statement this morning. I'll focus on 2 if I run out of time. Principle 1, businesses and financial markets hate uncertainty. Companies universally tell me they can deal with the higher costs of tariffs or other U.S. government actions if they just know about them well enough in advance and know how long those costs will be a problem for them. They will then take the steps needed to minimize the disruption to their businesses. Yet hovering over companies are the following uncertainties that have all of them in a state of limbo. Will the President impose tariffs of as much as 25% on imports from Mexico? Will the President impose tariffs on $300 billion in imports from China, and when? Will the President impose tariffs on imports of cars and parts from Europe and Japan? Will Congress pass USMCA? Will the President terminate NAFTA to motivate Congress to pass USMCA? Will a company get an exemption from the tariffs for products it cares about, and when will it hear one way or the other? Companies must guess on the answer to each of these questions to plan sourcing. A wrong guess will be expensive. Principle number 2, informed policy making should be the foundation of all government actions. This typically entails public notice and comment periods that are realistic and provide the opportunity for a full vetting of the various pros and cons of a proposed action or policy. It means that policymakers weigh the input and address concerns. It means an opportunity for independent assessments of the economic impacts of the tariffs by the U.S. International Trade Commission, for example, before the tariffs are imposed, not after. This did not happen in the case of the steel and aluminum quotas and tariffs. Section 301 process has been deemed by many as pro forma, with the expectation that the President will impose tariffs notwithstanding the comments submitted. Principle 3 is that companies need time to adjust to changes. It can take 6 months to 2 years to change suppliers. Sufficient advance notice is needed to preclude high costs, and that has not been the practice of the tariff implementation since 2018. They are announced and imposed less than a month later. The potential tariffs of 5% on imports from Mexico were threatened with an implementation date just 11 days later. In conclusion, there is a role for Congress to play in helping to lessen some of the costs of import restraints on American companies, their workers, and the economy generally. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The next witness is Dr. Fred Bergsten, who is the Director Emeritus at the Peterson Institute, who has served as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the Treasury, Undersecretary of Monetary Affairs, Assistant for International Economic Affairs at the National Security Council, and on the Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations. Having done all of that, here's the highlight. You're serving as a witness before this committee today. Welcome. You have 5 minutes, Dr. Bergsten.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. As you know, I'm also a native of Kansas City, lived in the area a long time. As you know, I'm a native of the Kansas City area. My parents lived there for a long time, so we have a particularly close relationship. I want to support what Laura Baughman just said in terms of the economic impact of the President's trade policy. Can you hear me?
It's not, something is not coming through. Yeah, maybe you have to speak a little closer. Can you
Pull the mic closer.
can you check on that?
Lean into it. All right. Start the clock again.
Thank you.
Give me an extra minute. Mr. Chairman, I want to support the economic analysis that Laura Baughman just gave you. I'll refer to some of similar numbers, but she's basically got it right. I have even bigger numbers. But I want to stress, in addition to the economic effect, how the Trump administration has clearly abused congressional intent and probably some of its legislative authorities in implementing its current trade policies. Those policies are levying heavy costs on the economy and foreign policy, and Congress should therefore take a series of urgent measures to rein in the excesses of the executive branch. I want to support what Chairman Waters just said, what you said a moment ago in your introductory comments. I believe Congress needs to act urgently to rein in the excesses of the executive branch. Let me tick off the difficulties in terms of these abuses, as I term them. First, there is no evidence that imports of steel and aluminum from some of our closest allies have damaged the national security of the United States. Hence, there is no justification for invoking the national security authorities of the Trade Expansion Act. Second, there would be even less justification for invoking the national security provision to impose import restrictions on motor vehicles and auto parts. It is ludicrous to argue, as the Secretary of Commerce did in February, that research and development by American auto companies, there are only 3 of them as he defines it, is essential for U.S. national security. It's also ludicrous to argue that R&D investment would be encouraged by restricting investment, by restricting competition in the U.S. auto market. Economics just don't work that way. Third, an even more egregious stretch is the President's threat, clearly still in place, to apply tariffs against all imports from Mexico unless that country takes far-reaching steps to restrict immigration. The legal justification would be a declaration of national emergency under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, a highly dubious proposition. And even if there were such an emergency, tariffs have never been used to pursue such a non-trade objective, and the act has never been used to impose tariffs. Fourth, the President has threatened to withdraw from NAFTA, including as a tactic to force Congress to support his renegotiated U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Withdrawal from NAFTA would disastrously disrupt supply chains in many sectors, including autos. The U.S. has never withdrawn from a free trade agreement, and it is unclear whether the President has legal authority to do so without congressional approval. So on a whole variety of counts, the President is abusing or threatening to abuse authority. This pattern, along with his extensive tariffs on China, this pattern of protectionism represents an unprecedented and massive reversal of U.S. trade policy. If fully implemented, all of these mooted tariffs would essentially apply a tax of 25% to over $1 trillion of U.S. imports. This would amount to a tax increase of more than $250 billion on the American public, which ultimately pays most, if not all, of the cost of the tariffs, without congressional approval. Massive tax increase without congressional approval, which would more than offset the tax cuts of a year ago. As Laura said, the uncertainty surrounding all these actions and threats dampens confidence in the economic outlook and will deter investment, as indicated in many business surveys of late and by the Blue Chip Business Council just last week, including when they met at the White House. These 3 economic effects, the massive tax cuts, the foreign retaliation against them that hits our exports and doubles the cost of the tariffs, plus the uncertainty.
I'm going to give the gentleman another minute because of the malfunction of the microphone.
That could take a full percentage point or more, probably 2 percentage points on Laura Baughman's analysis, off U.S. growth and even tilt the country into recession. The uncertainty also has a profound impact around the world on the credibility of the United States as a potential negotiating partner and as a faithful proponent of the rule of law. So in conclusion, the administration is clearly violating congressional intent and arguably at least some of the laws that it is invoking. I believe that Congress, per what Chairman Waters was saying just a moment ago, I believe Congress should now take action to require the President to seek its approval, to seek congressional approval, or at least consult with us, regarding any proposed new tariffs on the basis of an analysis of their potential benefits and costs in both economic and foreign policy terms. Congress should specify that just as the Congress must approve any new trade agreement, it must approve withdrawal from any trade agreement that had previously adopted. The upcoming USMCA legislation might provide an opportunity to make such changes in U.S. trade law, and I hope you will take it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next witness is Mr. John Boyd. Mr. Boyd is a Virginia farmer who produces soybeans, corn, and wheat, and in addition to raising cattle, hogs, and other animals, he is president and founder of the National Black Farmers Association and has served on the Clinton administration's Tobacco Commission. Mr. Boyd, you now have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the committee and the chairman for inviting me and having the opportunity to speak to the committee today, and also like to recognize Mrs. Waters thank you very much, Ms. Waters. My name is John Boyd, founder and president of the National Black Farmers Association. I'm a fourth-generation grain farmer and beef farmer from South Hill, Virginia. And quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, we're struggling. And because of the president's tariffs, farmers are in a national crisis. A national crisis. I want to say it again. And it seems as though many have turned a deaf ears to America's small farmers and black farmers alike. And I've been farming since 1983. And I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't be farming if I was not a good farmer since 1983. We're faced with acts of Mother Nature. We have to have a great relationship with Mother Nature and the weather. And my heart goes out to those Midwestern farmers today that are facing all of the rain that we can't control. But we should not be forced with a tariff. A tariff should come as a last-ditch effort. We need more diplomacy. A few years ago, I was selling soybeans, my major crop, for $16.80 a bushel. This past season was a disaster for my family farm, where I sold soybeans at $8 a bushel. And for those who don't understand the math, if you make $100,000, you're now making $50,000. And I have the same debts that I had last year. I have the high cost of seed per bag for these soybeans, $60 a bag, Mr. Chairman, that I'm paying for Roundup Ready soybeans that I really don't want to use anyway. That's another hearing. $60 a bag for soybeans. I'm faced with, now with the president's tariff, high cost of machinery. And my family was recently featured on a reality series called American Farm. And you could see some of the condition of my equipment. I need a new combine, but I can't pay $400,000, and now because of these tariffs, that equipment prices are steadily rising. Something needs to be done to help small-scale farmers and black farmers like myself. The president recently had a meeting with farmers and invited them to the White House. I've asked the president and the agriculture secretary for a meeting for a very long time in a public way, on CNN, on MSNBC, even on Fox News. I requested to meet with the agriculture secretary. That request has fell upon deaf ears. We're shuffled around from person to person. I've asked to meet with the president about this. We have 109,000 members in 42 states. We have some real issues that we would like to speak to this administration about. We reached out to the trade representative and asked for a meeting there. How can you close the largest market for soybeans in America, which is China, and then don't open up other avenues for farmers? That's the reason why you have $8 a bushel. These things should have been thought about before you impose the tariffs. And quite frankly, the president is affecting his base. The people who elected him, the people who elected the president are the American farmers out in the red states. Quite frankly, I didn't vote for this president. I didn't vote for him. But I believe in treating every person, regardless of party, with dignity and respect. And I can tell you right now, my financial situation on my farm isn't Republican. My financial situation on the farm isn't Democrat. My financial situation on the farm is real. We're facing a financial crisis. And with this thing, with the payout to the farmers, the president announced a swift payout to farmers, so it would come quickly. Here I'm just getting a $5,000 to $6,000 payment the 1st of June. How can a farmer expect to make that? And then we're helping companies that are in Brazil and Smithfield Foods. Smithfield Foods was the company that, when I rolled my truck up, Mr. Chairman, it said, we're not taking any grain right now because of the president's tariffs. So my testimony here today is we need to set aside some of this $16 billion that the president is proposing to help America's farmers and make sure that farmers like myself that look like me can get a check too. Anytime the government gets involved, and when they say there's going to be a speedy payout to farmers, it's always last for African-American farmers. It's always last for Latino farmers and small-scale farmers and women farmers. And it's just a call. All you do is call and call and call. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm requesting that this committee come up with some bipartisan legislation to help farmers like us and set aside at least $5 billion of this $16 billion that the president is proposing to help farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boyd. The next witness is Mr. Ronnie Russell. Mr. Russell is a Missouri farmer and a constituent. He produces corn, soybeans, wheat, hay, and alfalfa, who serves on the American Soybean Association Governing Committee, the Missouri Soybean Association Board of Directors, and as chairman of the Missouri Fertilizer Control Board. Mr. Russell, you now have 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Cleaver and Ranking Member Stivers and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify.
Yes, thank you. You're fine, thank you.
Okay, right, thank you. I am Ronnie Russell, a soybean farmer from Missouri, where I farm in Ray County. I'm a member of the American Soybean Association Board of Directors and serve on the ASA Governing Committee. My written testimony has been submitted on behalf of ASA. However, I would like to give you a firsthand account of how the current trade and tariff uncertainties have impacted my family and the long-term health of our farm. Things are bad in farm country right now, Mr. Chairman. If I were back on my farm in Missouri today, I would be planting my spring crops. However, the concerning reality of the farm economy and our rural communities has led me to speak today to give you an idea of what farmers in my rural community and many other communities across the heartland of America are experiencing. As a farmer producing soybeans, corn, wheat, and hay and alfalfa, I am no stranger to the perils and unpredictability of farming. I have been farming for 43 years and have seen my share of low prices and crop losses due to weather. This season has been one of the most challenging I have ever experienced. But as a farmer who has always had to deal with the possibility of inclement weather, I have tools at my disposal to mitigate a year with poor planting, flooding, or even drought. However, over the past year, I have endured threats to my farm that I cannot control or predict. The use of tariffs by the U.S. government has resulted in punitive retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports, particularly agricultural products. The most detrimental of these is the 25% retaliatory tariff on U.S. soybeans imposed by China July the 6th of 2018. These retaliatory tariffs have all but halted the shipment of U.S. soybeans to China, which up until last year was by far our largest export destination. In 2017, China purchased $14 billion worth of soybeans. This is no drop in the bucket. It has represented 31% of our total soybean production that year and 60% of our annual exports. The imposition of retaliatory tariffs by China has caused immediate and severe damage to the price of U.S. soybeans, which fell from $10.89 to $8.68 a bushel last summer. These low prices have continued and in some cases have dropped even further. Farmers are losing money on every acre of beans that we plant. The impact on my farm has been significant, and because this drop was driven not by weather or increased competition, but instead as a result of the government's use of tariffs, it is hard to determine the exact damage to my business. Soy farmers like me feel the impacts of the tariff war, and they are unsure if they will be able to make it through another growing season. Older farmers are considering retiring early to protect the equity that they built up in their farms, while younger producers are looking at finding other employment. We may also see the shuttering of more businesses in our rural communities whose livelihoods depend on the health of the farm economy. As late as April of this year, U.S. farmers were hopeful that an end to the ongoing tariff war with China was at hand. However, the recent increase in tariffs and the potential for future escalation is unacceptable. Our finances are suffering, and stress from months of living with the consequences of tariffs is mounting. Soybean growers need China's tariffs removed now. Long-term, what farmers and rural communities need is predictability and certainty, which only comes through maintaining and opening new markets where we can sell our products. For decades, the U.S. soybean farmer checkoff dollars went into developing China markets for soybeans. Our investments grew the Chinese market from $414 million in 1996 to $14 billion in 2017. While we are working hard to diversify and expand other market opportunities, the loss of the China market cannot be fully replaced. I ask Congress and urge the administration to conclude negotiations with China that immediately lift the Section 301 tariffs by the U.S. in exchange for China removing its 25% tariffs on U.S. soybeans. Thank you for inviting me to testify, and I am happy to answer any questions from the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Our final witness is Mr. Gordon Gray. Mr. Gray is Director of Fiscal Policy for the American Action Forum. Mr. Gray previously served as a series of congressional and campaign positions, most recently as Senior Policy Advisor to Senator Rob Portman, and was Deputy Director of Domestic and Economic Policy for Senator John McCain's presidential campaign. Welcome, Mr. Gray. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Cleaver, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member Stivers, and members of the committee, I'm honored to be before
Mr. Gray, hold up just a second. I think, I'm not sure what the problem
How's
is.
this? Is that good?
Pull the microphone up.
How's this?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's better. Thank you.
All right. I'm honored to be before you and among my fellow witnesses today to discuss the outlook for the U.S. economy and discuss that outlook in the context of developments in trade policy. In my testimony, I wish to make 3 basic observations. First, recent economic growth outperformed the trend that prevailed throughout the recovery, underscoring the significance of pro-growth policy. Second, public policy has had a meaningful effect on this outlook and can be instrumental in sustaining the recovery. Third, in the context of trade, reducing global trade barriers and expanding markets are pro-growth trade policies and should be pursued where possible. Let me discuss each of these in turn. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the U.S. economy began to recover from the Great Recession in June of 2009. 10 years on, the recovery continues. But the pace and character of the recovery matters deeply for American workers and households. For 7 years after the start of the recovery, the pace of national income, employment, and wage growth was positive but disappointing. Real GDP growth averaged 1.9% per year. That sluggish pace of growth equates to an average 1% per capita income growth. At that rate, it would take 70 years for an individual to double their standard of living, an achievement that used to take just 35 years, or about 1 working career. But more recently, the pace of growth has accelerated and has averaged somewhat above the sub-2% pace that prevailed during the most recent recovery. Indeed, over the past 9 quarters, GDP growth has averaged 2.7%. Reflecting this acceleration in growth, productivity has also strengthened. Most recent productivity data reflect the strongest annual growth since 2010. With higher growth in productivity, unemployment has continued to fall as payroll and wage growth have accelerated. Wage growth has improved overall, including for non-supervisory workers. The upshot of recent economic performance is that past need not be prologue. Moribund economic growth is not preordained. Ascribing the recent improvement in economic policy to any single policy would be dubious, but certainly public policy has had an effect on economic output. To the extent that the economy has improved, one could reasonably conclude that recent policy developments have contributed to more robust economic growth. The combined effects of the regulatory policy changes, the TCJA, and recent spending measures contributed to the recent improvement in economic growth and the related uptick in hiring and wage growth. These measures do not present unalloyed growth opportunities, however. Trade-offs and future risks attend to each of these and other policy changes, particularly with respect to trade, that have been pursued by the current administration. The current trade policy outlook is challenging. The United States is the most robust trading partner in the world, with combined trade volume in 2017 of goods and services valued at over $5.2 trillion. Among nations, the United States was the second largest exporter of goods and the largest exporter of commercial services. Trade is vital to the United States, the largest economy in the world, and the trade policy landscape is unsettled. Congress has an opportunity to contribute to improving the trade outlook by considering the USMCA. USMCA modernizes the existing NAFTA by adding protections for intellectual property and updating rules on digital trade. The agreement also updates prevailing trade rules related to the agricultural, manufacturing, and automotive industries. While the economic implications for the USMCA should not be overstated, demonstrating the capacity to ratify trade agreements would send a meaningful signal to global trading partners and remove some policy uncertainty from the economic horizon. The executive branch's approach to trade is also uncertain. The tariffs threatened and imposed by the President and related retaliatory actions by U.S. trading partners is irreducibly costly. According to estimates by my colleague Jackie Veras, the administration has imposed tariffs costing $69.3 billion on a combined $283.1 billion worth of imports. In response, the EU, China, Russia, Turkey, and India have imposed tariffs on $110 billion of U.S. goods. The administration has threatened additional tariff actions that could substantially raise costs to U.S. consumers. Ultimately, the cost of these tariffs must be weighed against the degree to which they are successful in achieving other beneficial trade policy aims. To the extent that the administration can use tariffs as a negotiating tool that secures more beneficial trade terms, particularly with respect to China's practices, the tariffs could be justified. If the tariffs do not produce an improvement in trading terms, however, they will simply remain a new tax on U.S. households. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this important topic. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. I would like to express appreciation on behalf of the committee to all of the witnesses. Thank you very much. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Without any objections, the written statements of all witnesses will be made a part of the record. I'm trying to get something straight. The Treasury Secretary has appeared before our committee twice this year, the full committee, and in both appearances, I focused my questions on the impact of the trade war on our country, but in particular, the agricultural component of our economy. And during his first appearance, the Secretary, in response to my question, said that the Chinese have, and I quote, have committed significant orders in the soybean markets. So I go home, I meet with the governor and a number of farmers, including Mr. Russell, the Missouri governor. We met with farmers, and I'm talking with people, and they who are soybean farmers, and they know nothing about this significant order. And so he said that they are in the markets executing those orders. Then when he returned, I was a little frustrated, but I always try to control my emotions, and so I did explain to him that he had not answered, or he answered the question, but I had no evidence that what he said was accurate. And so he sent a letter on May 28th after the committee had that hearing. And in this letter, he highlights that when looking at a snapshot of orders in a band of time, more orders were made. But it overlooks the point of where those orders were executed and whether they provided any real relief to farmers. So I need for at least those of you who are the two farmers to help me understand if you're feeling or seeing or know of any farmers who have been uplifted as a result of the Chinese issuing new purchasing orders. Mr. Russell and Mr. Boyd, either one, or both of you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to address that question. In my particular area, which is your district, we have seen no benefits from that. There maybe have been a little bit of movement within the price of soybeans from the Chicago Board of Trade based upon rumors. It's my understanding that the Chinese have verbally committed up to 20 million metric tons in purchases. However, the information that the American Soybean Association, through our partner and soy family member, the United States Soybean Export Council, the information that we have is that they've only really imported 6.5 million metric tons from those commitments.
Mr. Boyd?
Mr. Chairman, we haven't seen any good results from that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Yes. I talk loud anyway, so, but we have not seen any results from that. And the farmers are, especially the African-American farmers, we're mostly in the southeastern corridor of the United States and also in your district as well, the Boot Hill. We're hurting. We're hurting. We've lost our largest market, which is our soybeans. And like I said earlier, we're selling our soybeans for $8 a bushel. And there's no way that, I've heard some experts say, well, why don't you guys just sit it out? We're not in the financial condition to sit it out because we have equipment loans, we have mortgages, and for the first time in, I can say for a very long time, I don't have a farm operating loan. I'm at home planning right now on our grain operation off of credit cards and things of this nature. The top 10 banks, Mr. Chairman, haven't been favorable to African-American farmers. They greet us with a sense of arrogance.
I think, actually, I've heard my farmers say, I mean,
Yes.
you know, it's farmers period, I think, because I had a Century farmer at our meeting complain that his son may not be able to carry on and that they're having difficulty borrowing. So I don't.
Can I say something about that?
Sure, absolutely.
My son, who's for the first time was involved, our sons, excuse me, for the first time was involved in our farming operation. And because of what they experienced after these tariffs, I don't believe I'm going to have a son that's going to be interested in farming because we're selling soybeans at $8 a bushel. It's a hard sell to the next generation of farmers.
My time has expired. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Stivers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. I think it is really important. My first question is for Mr. Gray. Mr. Gray, many of us are concerned that the House is kind of dragging its feet with consideration of the USMCA, and I'm curious if you could talk about the importance of the need for expedited approval so we can reduce some of the uncertainty that was talked about by these colleagues, witnesses.
I'd be happy to address that. And I believe my fellow witnesses have also spoken to this. The uncertainty relating to trade in general has a chilling effect on business investment, which is one of the key channels that is through which we expect to see productivity growth, wage improvement from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That law was structured to improve the incentives to invest. The uncertainty relating to trade policy acts as a counterweight to that policy. So we have sort of two conflicting policy aims here that should be reconciled, in my view. And so I believe that consideration of the USMCA, and as I said in my statement, I don't believe that the economic effects of that agreement should be overstated. There's quite a bit to like in there, but there's also some downsides as well. And so I would just encourage the Congress to consider that and also consider it in the context of removing that policy uncertainty.
Mr. Russell and Mr. Boyd, as farmers, do you want to speak to what you think USMCA would mean to the American farmer, either one of you or both?
Well, obviously, for American agriculture, and in particular soybeans, having a working agreement and adopting the USMCA is extremely important for the American soybean farmers. Mexico is the #2 importer of American soybeans. So obviously, it's very important. Canada and Mexico represent our two largest trade partners and agriculture products as a whole. And I know that I personally, and also speaking on behalf of the American Soybean Association, we would certainly encourage the passage of the USMCA.
Great. Mr. Boyd?
I would like to say this. Farmers want free trade. We want free trade. I would much rather have a fair market, a good fair market price for my commodity than have anything to do with signing up for a program, getting in line, signing up for a program, and do the weight game and the paper shuffle. Anytime those two things are in combination, it's always bad for farmers like me. So any way that this committee could work with the administration and lean into their ear and let the administration know that farmers, I'm really not interested in a $16 billion bailout. We need creative ways to open up new markets so that we can get the prices back up so that I could go on and farm, because I'm what's called a cash and carry farmer.
Yeah.
I'm not storing any grain on my farming operations, and we farm on numerous tracts of land.
Thank you. Well, and you stated it earlier very well when you said your farm's not a Republican farm or a Democrat farm. It's a farm. And you got to open markets to make money. So I appreciate that, and I hope all my colleagues will take note of that. I'd like to switch to China, and I would like to enter for the record a paper that Dr. Bergsten produced in October of 18 entitled China and the United States, Trade Conflict and Systematic Competition. Mr. Chairman, if we could enter that into the record.
Objection.
Thank you. Dr. Bergsten, I think this paper provides a really insightful context of some of the issues that we're discussing today. In your testimony today, you stated that there's widespread agreement that China's trade and industrial policies have to be reformed. How do you think we can convince China to come to the negotiating table and make changes? And are there ways to do that either without inflicting pain on the United States economy through tariffs, or with inflicting as little pain as possible on the United States economy? And I know that I'm only giving you 36 seconds.
I appreciate your kind comments on my paper. I think the main thing we need to do to get those needed reforms in China, and they are needed, is to forge an effective multilateral coalition of all the world's major trading countries, which I think would join us in that effort to focus on the main issue. The problem, the administration, I think, has correct goals in its effort with China. Its methods have been wrong. And it has compounded that error by waging war against its own allies with the steel tariffs, the aluminum tariffs, other trade actions, disrupting the World Trade Organization. We need to rally around the traditional U.S. coalition of free trading countries who want to get rid of barriers to approach China to do it. China never wants to be isolated internationally.
Dr. Bergsten, I'm out of
But
time.
we have isolated ourselves internationally, and we need to reverse that.
Would you be willing to submit for the record of maybe more full explanation? You did a great job, but since I'm out of time, I yield back, and if you could give that to us in writing, that was a good start, but thank you for that.
Be happy to do so.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stivers. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, the chair of the full committee, is now recognized for such time as she may consume.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, let me welcome all of our witnesses here today, and let me say a special welcome to Mr. Boyd. He's been in the struggle for so many years now. He was at the very first hearing that was ever held about the plight of black farmers that I conducted as chair of the Black Caucus, and I want you to know he's been a strong advocate that helped us get rid of discrimination in USDA. And I want to tell you, I see him here today, but I don't know if he brought his horse and buggy with him the way he used to do. He used to bring along a parade of farmers advocating for justice, particularly for minority farmers. Having said that, I understand very thoroughly the negative impact that these tariffs are having on all of our states. But let me tell you, California stands to lose a lot. In terms of sheer volume, California conducts more trade with China than any other state in the country. Total trade with China tops $175 billion. That, along with the flow of Chinese investment into the state, can seriously impact California's GDP growth and crush its $2.7 trillion economy. I'm quoting from an article from Mr. Scott Cohen, who wrote extensively about how the trade war with China could crush California's $2.7 trillion economy and hurt other states. Having taken a look at what this president is doing, and I'm so pleased that, I'm hearing from this panel and other panels about the fact that the president is creating harm to his so-called base. And some of that base is saying, we don't want a charity, we don't want a bailout, we want to do business as you have described here, and I think others have described. But I want to know about what the president is doing, bailing out plants that's operated by something called GBS. Anybody familiar with this? What JBS is? The largest meat packer in the world with the program designed to help domestic companies and producers under economic stress. This is a Brazilian firm. Would you please respond to that, Mr. Boyd?
Yes, I would like to, and thank you very much for your comments.
Yes.
And that hearing was September 22nd, 1997. I never
Wow, thank you for reminding what date it was.
in my life.
Yes.
Farmers like myself receive a minuscule amount from the president's relief package, where I was hopefully I was going to receive some $40,000+. By the time they do the deductions on the $1.67 per bushel is what the administration said each farmer would be able to get per bushel for their losses. From that, Congresswoman, I actually received a little, I believe somewhere, it's in my testimony, $6,000. And I just received that this month, and I applied way back in last year. But to answer your question, companies like that should not be benefiting from America's tax dollars, and you have farmers like myself out here struggling and can't make ends meet. And the administration isn't acting swiftly enough to make sure farmers like myself and other small-scale farmers around the country receive their payments as well. And there seems to be no accountability at the Department of Agriculture. And as you heard me express in my testimony, I've reached out to meet with Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue. Well, I don't think that was the same gentleman that I was lobbying years ago in Georgia. Something's happening there, Congresswoman. But this administration has turned a deaf ear, So my point of it is foreign-owned companies should not be benefiting.
This
while
Brazilian
farmers like
company,
myself are suffering.
this Brazilian company has gotten part of the first bailout money. USDA signed a contract to purchase 22.3 million of that pork from JBS USA, and that's the American arm of this gigantic Brazil-based meat company that owns massive shares of U.S. beef, chicken, and pork markets. And I understand that there's some fraud involved. We are looking at that in my office, and so we're hopeful to unveil that. But if I may just say that I wish we could get some money back from him of the $16 billion that he is getting from USDA. We're not going to be able to do that, and he's going to keep on with this tariff and this trade war that he has created. So you're going to have to get back on the street again. We're going to have to organize again. We're going to have to go up against this president who does not care about the harm that he's causing. And having said that, the final answer is we got to get rid of the president. I know the other side of the aisle won't like this, but he's a problem. And he's a problem in more ways than one, and he's hurting the farmers of this country. I yield back.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, thank you for, thank you, Madam Chair. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might be somewhat of a unique person here today, as I'm a car dealer and I'm a rancher. And we do have elections coming up in 18, so you can do what you want to do on those. Or 20. President Trump has made renegotiating NAFTA one of the top priorities in his office. His administration has come up with a new free trade agreement, which we've been talking about with our two most reliable trading partners in Mexico and Canada, called USMCA. After reviewing the specifics of the deal, it seems as if he has done a really good job in negotiating for the American people. Of all the partisan issues that we deal with on Capitol Hill, I'm hopeful this trade agreement will be something that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle can rally behind to show the American people that we can still get important things accomplished in these polarized times. And I'd like to say to you, Mr. Russell and Mr. Boyd, I want to thank you for your expressing to us the importance of Congress acting on this deal, and appreciate your support of it. That's a big deal to have that happen. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is working. Businesses are spending more money on inventories, employment, and capital goods that are revitalizing Main Street America. Capitalism is working, and it's showing it more than ever, and we need to continue this momentum. Now, Mr. Gray, my first question to you is, are you a capitalist or are you a socialist?
I'm a capitalist.
Thank you. We seem to be winning that battle. Thank you very much. In your testimony, you express a similar sentiment that on the benefits the tax bill is having on the economy. However, you also state major forecasters predict that the U.S. economy will slow over the next few years. But this is not inevitable. Sound pro-growth policy can meaningfully improve the economic outlook. So my question is, what pro-growth policy would you recommend we focus on in this committee so we can ensure that there is no economic slowdown in the next several years?
So I think one of the key decisions that the Congress can consider is, first is do no harm, and so that includes the very hard work of removing some risks from the economic outlook. Those risks include long understood risks. So we know that the society is aging, and so that we can't count on a growing labor force. That means that we have to really think about and focus on sort of the other half of the long-term economic sort of growth equation, and that's productivity. And that's where public policy can really matter. That's where business investment can really matter. That's where sound tax policy can really matter. That's why introducing more certainty in the trade outlook can matter. That's also why removing the risk of a future fiscal crisis can really matter. So I would encourage the Congress to turn to the structural challenges that we've long understood and have faced and try to remove some of those risks.
Thank you. I'm not a fan of tariffs. I'll tell you that right now, and I have spoken with the White House about our differences on this issue. As a small business owner, I have seen how tariffs turn into indirect tax on consumers and increases the cost of doing business. So with that being said, many countries around the world levy tariffs on our exports, so we import goods with far fewer restrictions. A study from the World Economic Forum states that the average tariff the U.S. faces in foreign markets is 5.9%, which is 4 times higher than the average tariffs imposed on goods coming into our country. Now, I know these numbers have changed somewhat because of the administration's trade actions, but it leaves me with a question. Ms. Baughman, what tools are at our disposal to ensure that other countries are treating the United States exports fairly other than retaliatory tariffs?
Well, we have a host of trade remedies in this country that address unfair import competition, anti-dumping rules, countervailing duty rules, Section 201 rules. We have lots of ways to address unfairness in foreign markets. With respect to our exports and retaliation against our exports, I mean, the best thing we can do is adhere to our WTO commitments and not do things that trigger retaliation, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Well, we want to be on a fair playing field. My question was, what would you do?
To get a fair playing field with China, for example?
Well, what tools, what would you do that would help the U.S. exports be fairly treated other than tariffs?
Trade agreements, number 1, 2, and 3. Negotiate good, strong trade agreements, bilateral, regional, and multilateral through the WTO, strengthen the rules of the WTO to apply to more trade practices, including some of the trade practices at issue in China, strengthen those rules and make them enforceable in some way. There are a number of things that we can do in that regard.
Okay, thank you. My time is up. Tax cuts work.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and I thank the panel for its testimony today, and my friend Mr. Williams and I disagree on the tax cuts and the benefits to everyday Americans, and the fact that this year we're going to have $896 billion deficit because of those tax cuts that cost us a couple $1 trillion. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about tariffs, and I want to talk about the corrupting effect these tariffs have on capitalism. And so, Dr. Bergsten, I was interested in your testimony. I feel like we have an imperial presidency. These tariffs that the president, one day we're going to raise tariffs on China, next day we're going to lower them, next day we're going to raise them, the stock market goes up and down and up and down. And if You know, if we can find some insider trading based on that, it's going to be interesting. But you were talking about the fact, you know, this is the National Security Subcommittee, and the president is using national security to raise and lower and jawbone on the tariffs. Talk to me a little bit about how you think the Congress should be involved in establishing any kind of protectionism that these tariffs might introduce into the system.
I think there are at least two things the Congress should do. One is to define national security much more sharply than is the case in current statutes. The phrase national security is used broadly in the Trade Expansion Act. It's used broadly in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Internationally, it's used very broadly in the World Trade Organization. And it provides a gigantic loophole for anybody who wants to abuse the concept, as I would argue the president is now doing. So, point one.
No, I would say when we challenge Canada and we claim we need to raise tariffs on Canada, one of our best friends, if not our best friend in the world, in the name of national security, is ridiculous. And that's what I'm talking about, an imperial presidency, that there are checks and balances and responsibilities, and this president has run amok in the name of national security. So your second point.
And just to amplify what you say, to think about doing it for autos against NATO allies like Germany and France and the UK and others would be equally ludicrous. But that's also been put on the table and still is out there and could happen. So that's point one. Point two, as I emphasized in my statement, is to require that any future tariff increases be approved by the Congress.
Thank you very much. And I agree with that. And I want to say to Mr. Russell, Mr. Boyd, and to you, you all are free traders. And, you know, let's talk about capitalism. Let's talk about free trade. Let's win because of competition and the ability to be a good farmer, you know, or a good salesman or produce a good product. And so, Ms. Baughman, I want to turn my attention to you. In my district, just outside of Denver, we have a major can company. I have lots of craft breweries. I have Coors Brewing. I have the outdoors industry. So when the president says we're winning on these tariffs, I mean, how would you respond to that?
Well, we're definitely not. Those companies that you've mentioned are all facing or are about to face in the Outdoor Industry Association huge increases in their costs. They're becoming less productive, less competitive in producing goods here in the United States because their inputs to production have gone up in price. Consumers and families in your districts are going to start screaming pretty soon if the tariffs go into effect on all those products on List 4, many of which are produced by the Outdoor Industry Association and others, members of that association. So yeah, we're going to start seeing in the next year or so, if not by this fall, some substantial increases in inflation and reductions. We've already starting to see reductions in manufacturing indexes.
Thank you. So I guess just to conclude my tirade up here, Dr. Bergsten, you wanted to say something.
Just to add, some Americans do win from the tariffs. They do protect some jobs and some firms, but at an enormous price. The steel tariffs save about 12,000 U.S. steel jobs at a cost of almost $1 million per job.
And the aluminum tariffs hurt my district substantially because of the craft brewers and the canning companies that I have. And with that, I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, thank the panel for being here, and I want to echo my thanks to Mr. Russell and Mr. Boyd for talking about USMCA and the importance of getting that agreement through the Congress promptly. I mean, in fact, I think that would be a much better use of our time today is for our panelists to all be over in the Capitol advocating for that in Mrs. Pelosi's office. I'm pleased that she's continued her due diligence on this, but this is the single most important thing I think we can do for employment, sales, and our agricultural industry in America in the near term is get USMCA through the Congress successfully. I share Dr. Bergsten's concerns about across-the-board use of tariffs as a weapon and not a distinct targeted approach. Certainly share that. I've written the President many times about Section 232 is not well used in this instance. I agree with my friend from Colorado that applying it to Canada and Mexico might be a good short-term negotiating tactic, but it's certainly not in keeping with the intent of the act on national security purposes. And we do have other ways to deal with dumping in terms of if we think China, which is the largest dumper of steel and aluminum in the world and impacting the EU and the United States and Canada for that matter, then we ought to put those penalties on China as a part of our negotiation and not do it as we've done it across the board. I will say, though, that all presidents deal in trying to protect American industry. Every administration does that, and I think we're here today because the majority controls this panel. They don't support this president, so we're picking on Donald Trump's trade policy, but we could have, I think the Democratic House did the same thing during the Reagan administration, and I'm sure the Republican House did the same thing in the Clinton administration in the late 90s. So let's be clear that this is, for the most part, a lot about politics. On soybeans in Arkansas, we are obviously not in the top 10 producers, but we produce a lot of soybeans. For a third of my career was lending money to people like Mr. Russell and Mr. Boyd in agriculture, and I know what a bad 3 years it's been, but I also recall that when I started that lending, soybeans were $5 a bushel in 1999, and we always joked, a pack of cigarettes cost more than a bushel of soybeans then, but somehow we made it through those very, very low prices in 99 and 2000, and yields are certainly somewhat improved over that period. My question, Mr. Gray, is this macro impact of tariffs. People are projecting forward and using the most pessimistic case about it, but in my review of the economic literature, it looks like 2/10 to 3/10 of GDP growth is what is being projected as the most GDP impact of fully implemented tariffs that are contemplated with China. Do you agree with something in that range?
That's broadly consistent with some of the estimates I've seen,
Yeah.
but there is certainly a range, and so
There is, and I just want to be on the record that it could potentially be a fairly modest GDP hit if fully implemented. I'm not supportive of it. I'm just simply describing that not everybody agrees that it's a major, major downturn in American business from it. I'm more concerned about the inflationary aspect of it if it were fully implemented, when we go from intermediate goods, where I think producers are eating a lot of that cost currently, versus directly on consumer goods. Do you share my concern about inflation impacts?
well, certainly to the extent that that translates into just general welfare loss, and that's one of the more pernicious aspects of tariffs. That's a risk.
And this is why it's, I think, also bizarre how people are suggesting the Federal Reserve and monetary policy is supposed to have something to do with trade. I would submit that if it doesn't have major macroeconomic growth factors, and yet it is inflationary, then the Fed ought to be concerned about raising rates, not cutting rates. What's your view on that, Mr. Gray?
My own view is that, the Federal Reserve has their dual mandate, and I think they're charged with exercising that mandate with respect to sort of the circumstances in front of them.
Yeah, I thank you for that. This is a complex area. I think we need to be targeting our work and focus on China and get results from that. I know on behalf of the ag community, we want to prompt a success to that negotiation with China to benefit America and the EU and Japan. But the most important thing we can do is get the USMCA promptly approved in the Congress. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Wexton, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before us today and providing this interesting testimony. I represent a very economically diverse district in Northern Virginia. Mr. Boyd, I'm proud to have you here as a fellow Virginian, and while you're down all the way in South Side, I represent the northernmost part of Virginia, from just outside of Washington, D.C., out to the Shenandoah Valley. And so it is very economically diverse. It includes a vibrant tech sector in the eastern part of the district through to, as it becomes more and more rural, we've got wineries, distilleries, and a whole lot of apple growers out in Frederick County. But one thing that is happening is that the impacts of the tariffs are being felt across economic sectors, even in places where you wouldn't expect it. Just yesterday, in fact, I received an email from a constituent, which I'm going to read to you. Help, all caps and 3 exclamation points. We own a small local large format printing business based in Sterling in my district. We are getting swamped by increases from our vendors since many of our products use hardware made from aluminum, often from China, i.e. banner stands. The Chinese trade war is bad for our business. Today, I just received notice from my largest hardware vendor that pricing on our most popular banner stand base jumped 26%. I will have to pass this along to customers, but I can see that this may reduce demand for many of our products. This could be super painful. It is already difficult enough to run a small business. So these are the things that we're hearing every day from producers, from agricultural producers to small businesses to high-tech businesses. And a couple questions that I have for some of the panelists. A recent report from the Peterson Institute shows that while China's raising tariffs on U.S. imports, they're actually lowering tariffs on other nations that compete with the U.S., and that they're trying to limit their economic damage that way. I'd ask Ms. Baughman and Dr. Bergsten, can you elaborate on what we can expect to see, in terms of long-term consequences, changing the supply chains, and are other countries taking them up on this and filling the void left by the lack of American imports?
On that specific analysis, you're absolutely right. The U.S. has hit itself doubly with the trade war. It has prompted retaliation against the U.S., like the high China tariffs that we're all talking about, but it has also prompted other countries to liberalize to their trading partners other than the United States. As you said, China has actually, many people don't realize this, reduced its barriers, its import tariffs across the board in autos and many other sectors, except to the United States because of the trade war. So now, the average Chinese tariff against the United States is 20, and the average tariff against the rest of the world is 6. That's against a base of 8, where they started. 8 to 20 against us, 8 down to 6 against everybody else. We got a double whammy. In addition, lots of other countries have been forming free trade agreements among themselves. President Trump erroneously dropped out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been a huge boon to U.S. agriculture. But it didn't stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It went ahead without us. So the other countries, who represent a third of the world economy, are now giving each other duty-free treatment into each other's markets while maintaining their barriers against us. So we now are discriminated against in the markets of other countries because of our own trade policy.
Thank
it's
you,
exactly
Dr.
what you say in spades.
I'm going to reclaim my time at this point because I'm running out. Also, in my district, the tech industry supports more than 100,000 jobs. Mexico is the #1 export market for our U.S. consumer technology sector. The industry estimates that it's lost about $1 billion per month since October. If the plan to impose tariffs on Mexico goes forward, what should we expect to see in this consumer technology sector, and what do you think will happen? Ms. Baughman, do you have an estimate of that?
People are terrified about that. A lot of the folks who have been moving out of China in response to the tariffs on China have been moving to Mexico, among other countries. But Mexico, of course, is at the top of their list because of the potential for USMCA. So they'll get slammed pretty badly, and they are very, very concerned about it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I will yield back my time at this point.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My questions will be fairly quick. I want to focus on USMCA and how critical its consideration is for my home state of Ohio and the rest of our country. Ohio exports rely on trade with Canada and Mexico. They are two of our largest markets, with $28 billion exported to these two countries from our state last year. Canada and Mexico buy more U.S.-made goods than the United States' next 11 trading partners combined. To me, this is a no-brainer. We should be acting swiftly to kickstart the TPA process and begin consideration of USMCA. USITC report came back. It said, I believe, over 0.25% in GDP, over 170,000 jobs added to the economy, will lift all boats, in particular manufacturing and agriculture. I have yet to hear a single argument, not one, anywhere, from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle as to why they would not be willing to support this and why they do not want to see it on the House floor. I would love to hear somebody argue that. I've heard a lot about how much we don't like President Trump from the other side. I understand that. But I've not heard any economic case whatsoever that we shouldn't be considering USMCA. It's a no-brainer, and I would love to hear somebody make that case. So let me ask a quick question from everybody on the panel. Yes or no, is USMCA an improvement over NAFTA? Start with Mr. Gray.
I think all in, on net, incrementally, that would be my judgment.
I would say yes, especially for the agriculture sector, yes.
Mr. Boyd?
I don't think so.
Don't think so.
I think it's a very modest improvement, but it should be voted because the alternative could be a withdrawal from NAFTA or USMCA, and therefore it should go ahead.
Thank you.
Yes, because it really updates NAFTA in very significant ways.
Thank you very much. And sort of a second point, obviously it has been a brutal year for farmers, absolutely brutal. In Ohio, we've had horrible weather, as you highlighted earlier, and the tariffs have hurt our farmers, absolutely, no argument from me on that. It is my belief, again back to USMCA, this makes us stronger in the negotiation against China. This gives certainty to our markets. Mr. Gray, would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I think in substance and in the overall, in terms of process, this is worthwhile.
Thank you. And in closing, I want to go back to where I started. Somebody, please, on the other side of the aisle, make the argument against USMCA. This won't cost us a thing to vote on this bill. It's a massively important trade deal. Everybody on the panel, with the exception of Mr. Boyd, has suggested that it is a good idea that we go forward with it. I haven't met a single person in my district who is against the USMCA. Republican, Democrat, Independent. This is good for business. This is great for American jobs. It is great for manufacturing. It is great for agriculture. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Just for the record, I don't know of anybody who's made a statement that they are opposed to USMCA. So just for the record. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me, three of our witnesses focus on economic and trade issues. And I'll ask the whole panel, raise your hand if you were actively working against NAFTA back in the 1990s. I see no hands going up. Raise your hand if you were actively opposing a permanent MFN for China back roughly around the year 2000. No hands go up. If I lead an unworthy life and the Almighty decides to send me somewhere where I would pay for my sins, I will be sent to a place where I'm surrounded by Wall Street Democrats and Wall Street Republicans and told that that both sides are represented. I'll use my 5 minutes here not in defense of Donald Trump, but in defense of the traditional Democratic view. Democrats voted no on NAFTA, CAFTA, and SHAFTA. Democrats by 2/3 voted no on MFN for China. And yet we have a panel where we don't have anybody who took those positions. So someone has to speak for the traditional Democratic view, and that is that trade deficits matter, that every $1 billion of trade deficit is another 10,000 jobs lost, and that while our unemployment rate is low, if we don't add 2 or 3 more million jobs, we will not create the labor shortage necessary to see the increase in wages that the working class of this country has been denied for the last 2 decades. Unless we can raise real wages by 10, 20, or 30%, we will not redeem what has been over 2 lost decades. People say, how can you oppose MCA? It's obvious the country has some questions, or they call it what it is. If you support it, be honest enough and to say it's NAFTA 2.0. And so the question is, do we want NAFTA 2.0? Well, if the choice is between NAFTA 2.0 and NAFTA 1.0, we can lay the two agreements next to each other. They are incredibly similar. We'll notice a few changes, and we can decide. But if the choice is whether to pull out of NAFTA altogether or to go with NAFTA 2.0, that is a very complicated issue, especially when, over the objections of the Democratic Party in this House, we've knitted together these 3 economies in a way that would be difficult to respond to. I chair the Asia Subcommittee. Trump didn't start the trade war. China started the trade war 20 years ago, and the wreckage of America exceeds anything done to us at Pearl Harbor. And yet, for 20 years, we did nothing. For 20 years, we were told tariffs are bad, so we'll go through legal processes and trade dumping disputes. How's that worked out for us? We have the largest trade deficit in the history of mammalian life on this planet, and we keep saying, let's go back to giant trade deficits. Let's go back to just checking the boxes and not looking at the non-tariff barriers that China is able to put up. Let's just say, well, if we can just get them to reduce their tariffs, that is not a market economy. That is an economy where any major corporation that imports any major American product in contravention of the policies of the Communist Party of China will be sent to an re-education camp. They know that. And that's why they don't buy American planes unless we move the plane factories. That's why you can't make something in the United States and sell it in China until they force you to make it in China and then transfer the technology. And we're told, let's go back to the good old days. Those days were so bad, they elected Donald Trump as a scream of pain from Western Pennsylvania, from Michigan and Wisconsin. And that pain has not been forgotten. If the Democratic Party abandons the Democratic Party, we'll get in 2020 what we got in 2016. I yield back.
The gentleman does not yield back.
Oh.
The gentleman's out of time.
Oh, the gentleman is out of time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver. In simple terms, economic growth is a function of an increase in the number of hours worked times an increase in labor productivity of those hours. It follows then that in order to increase economic output, the focus should be on increasing the amount of hours worked and the productivity of those hours. Allowing capital to flow where it is most productive should enable these two things to occur. Mr. Gray, can you talk a little bit about how the Tax Cut and Jobs Act has helped increase labor productivity in our country?
Certainly, I'd be delighted. In particular, the business portions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the reduction in the statutory rate, the 5-year expensing provision were designed to improve the incentive to invest in the United States. That was to reverse what the previous administration's economic report of the president noted as a problem in terms of productivity, and that was the slowing of capital deepening, essentially the accumulation of capital for workers, which is central to productivity growth. That was what the business elements of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was designed to incentivize. The evidence is that there has been an investment response. However, there are some other risks in the economy that have possibly muted that, and that's something that we're going to want to keep our eye on.
And what about on the employment side?
So I think we have observed particularly for this late stage in the recovery, I mean, we're about to hit the 10-year anniversary, we saw an acceleration in payroll growth. We saw the labor market draw in workers that were not in the labor force for the balance of the Great Recession. That was remarkable, particularly in the 10th year of the recovery, to see the pace of employment growth actually accelerate. I think these are important accomplishments for the economy.
Thank you. We have a record low unemployment rate in this country. Unemployment incredibly low at 3.6%, the lowest rate in my lifetime. And for those of you who can see me, that's been quite a while. So I applaud the President and I applaud the initiative of the prior Congress for helping to extend this and expand the current expansion. In my home state of Tennessee, we have an incredibly low unemployment rate, historically low there as well, of 3.2%. And I might add record low unemployment for minorities and for women and for other typically or historically disadvantaged groups. So the great fruits of the economic policies that President Trump and his administration and the prior Congress put in place. But as a country, we can and must improve our labor participation rate. The most recent numbers from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics has the labor force participation rate at 62.8%. That is, there are still a lot of potential workers sitting on the sidelines, not actively seeking employment. Can you talk, Mr. Gray, a little bit about how the TCJA will help facilitate getting people off the sidelines and back in the game?
So I think you have kind of two primary channels that we can sort of identify. One is just specific provisions. So and the CBO mentioned this in their recent baseline, which is that the reductions in labor taxes, all else equal, incentivize the supply of labor, so people will tend to work more than they otherwise would, given the reduction in labor taxes. So that's one element. The second is, to the extent that the TCJA improves the economy, then that improving economic environment will draw workers into the labor force as they see wages and grow. That incentivizes them to work as well.
Thank you. While some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may wish to denigrate the tax reform passed into law last year, I do think it is in all Americans' interest to be supportive of policies that help increase the amount of workers and the productivity of their work. That is where capital should flow, to the places it can be most productive. We should avoid picking winners and losers here in Washington, and after all, we don't have to, because a rising tide truly does lift all boats. A simpler tax code and lower effective rates will help American businesses compete on merits, and I believe American workers, small business owners, and shareholders under these new conditions are only poised to succeed, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Before I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, I think this partisan polarization grows and almost without bounds. So I don't think we need to fight any fights that don't exist. And so I want to enter into the record without objection where the trade representative is saying we won't rush the USMCA in Congress. And as I'll repeat again, I don't know of anybody trying to fight against it from here. And this is today, June 19, 2019, at 11:13 Eastern Standard Time. So I would like to enter this into the record. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses who have testified this morning. I'd like to begin with Dr. Bergsten. In an online Peterson Institute post on March 11th this year, titled "A Currency Deal with China?" You stated, quote, "Trump has long been upset about the U.S. bilateral trade deficit with China, which actually rose to a record $419 billion in 2018, despite his imposing tariffs of $250 billion worth of imports from China. According to economist Robert Scott, the IMF predicts that the U.S. current account deficit will nearly double between 2016 and 2022. Scott writes, quote, "Unless these trends are offset by a rapid decline in the value of the U.S. dollar, rapidly rising trade deficits could be devastating for U.S. manufacturing, likely giving rise to massive job loss on the scale experienced in the 2000-2007 period, when 3.5 million U.S. manufacturing jobs were lost." In March, President Trump said, quote, "I want a strong dollar, but I want a dollar that does great for our country, not a dollar that's too strong to make it prohibitive for us to do business with other nations." Dr. Bergsten, can you talk about the impact of a strong dollar on this trade deficit?
That's a crucial point, Congressman Garcia, because the single most important price for U.S. international competitiveness is the exchange rate of the dollar, because that's what prices all of our products in both export markets and import competing markets vis-a-vis the competition in the rest of the world. By most people's estimates, including those at our Peterson Institute, but also the IMF, the dollar is now overvalued by probably 10 to 15%. And that does translate into a much larger U.S. trade deficit than if the dollar was not overvalued. So I have always been in favor of a competitive dollar. Secretaries of the Treasury have talked over the years about a strong dollar without ever defining it, but it implies a dollar that maybe responds primarily to financial flows, capital movements, and does not accurately reflect the underlying competitive position of the United States and other countries. But the trick is how to achieve an equilibrium exchange rate for the dollar. Over the years, we've done it in different ways. In the Reagan administration, Secretary of the Treasury Jim Baker negotiated the Plaza Agreement with our major trading partners, who cooperatively agreed to bring down an overvalued dollar, cut the U.S. trade deficit at the time in half, restored equilibrium. Now the situation is very tricky because, as various members, particularly on the Republican side, have said today, the U.S. economy is very strong. And that attracts capital from around the world. It strengthens our investment. That's a good thing. But it also pushes up the exchange rate of the dollar. In the current environment, when we have full employment, when we have rapid growth, when we have a strong economy, it's hard to argue, as Scott does, that we need a better trade balance or a weaker dollar. At the same time, he's right that over time, if the dollar remained overvalued, it would weaken our manufacturing sector and other tradable goods industries, including, incidentally, agriculture. So what the administration should be doing is trying to work toward a gradually depreciating dollar that will reduce the U.S. trade deficit over time without disrupting the world economy and adding more uncertainty to the current situation, which, because of the trade war, is already very uncertain.
So gradual is the key word there, I believe. And finally, before my time runs out, how might tariffs further impact the strengths of the dollar, and what policy proposals are you aware of that might correct the strong dollar's impact on our trade deficit?
The tariffs have a paradoxical effect. The tariffs aim to reduce U.S. imports, and they do, and that would strengthen our trade balance, but that would lead to a stronger dollar in the exchange markets. And in fact, empirical studies show that countries that put on lots of trade barriers do not, repeat, do not improve their trade balances, in part because there's an offsetting effect in the exchange markets. So anybody, including the current administration, who thinks that tariffs strengthen the trade balance are simply incorrect, both theoretically and empirically. Now, what to do about it? A big problem, and I mentioned it in that article you referred to, is that other countries have manipulated the currency. The answer to that, frankly, is for us to counter it directly. I have supported for many years countervailing currency intervention. If China buys $1 billion worth of dollars to keep our currency overvalued, we buy $1 billion of their currency to offset it, neutralize its impact in the currency markets, and believe me, if we commit to do that, they'll be deterred, they won't do it, manipulation will disappear, and that part of dollar overvaluation will be avoided.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized, Mr. Riggleman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And Mr. Boyd, I'm happy to be your congressman. And I'm happy to be, I love Mecklenburg County, yes, sir. And I don't think people realize the size of our district before I get started. We go from Fauquier County down to the North Carolina border. And if you talk about Mecklenburg County, it actually borders 4 counties and North Carolina, so it is huge. Number two, I almost laughed when somebody said NAFTA 2.0, because Mr. Boyd knows if we say NAFTA down in South Hill, or we say NAFTA in Lunenburg County, or we say NAFTA in Pennsylvania County, or Halifax County, or Franklin County, or Bedford County, or Campbell County, you'll get run out of town. So that's why I don't want to call it NAFTA 2.0, and you know that, sir. And so I'm glad you're here. I also got my aide here, so he's going to give you the card. So if you have any issues getting a meeting with anybody in the administration or with me, I'll go ahead. We'll try to make that happen, and I'll come see you on your farm. How does that sound? Yes, sir. So as we get started, I find it a little bit interesting because I know a little bit about farming in the 5th District of Virginia. Before, after I was a CEO of a DoD company, as a lot of people know, I run a distillery. So, I deal with wheat, corn, barley, rye. We deal with a whole kind, everything you could possibly imagine when it comes to agricultural produce, spent mash. So I have a little bit of an interest in that, and plus I grow some of that on my own farm. I think the second thing that we have is that when I looked at the comparison between NAFTA and USMCA, and I looked at what it would create, I think it's pretty spectacular. And for me, when you look at Southside, and I think where me and Mr. Boyd probably are of like minds, we talk about a 3.6% unemployment rate in the United States. The 5th District's around 3%, but there's actually a 2 to 2.5% delta between the northern part of my district and the southern part of my district. Last was 2.4% unemployment in Fauquier County, which is 4 hours from you. And down around, you're talking about Danville or into Brunswick County, was as high as 4.7 to 5.2%. So there's a huge delta. Why? Because we've had problems with agriculture. The reason the USMCA is so important to me, and I'm going to go into something that I know a little bit about. Number one is here just are some of the US ITC's stats on this. USMCA would raise the U.S. real GDP by $68 billion, would create approximately 176,000 new jobs, directly related to 12 million jobs in the United States. It would increase exports to Canada and Mexico by $33.3 billion, and it would actually increase total U.S. agriculture and food exports by $2.2 billion. You're like, well, Denver, why is that so darn important? It's because my district is 65% rural. 65%. And by the way, it's over 10,000 square miles. So some of the other issues. Now, I had questions written out, so as you can see, I'm not looking at my questions too much right now because I know a little bit about this. And that's why I think right now when we talk about this, the same questions that everybody asked, they were going to ask you, I was going to ask you, how do we level the playing field against China, and how do we continue the economic boom that we've experienced over the last 2.5 years? Well, that's fantastic. It's fantastic for the first part of my district. Bottom part of my district, it's not so fantastic. There isn't an economic boom. And that's why the USMCA is so important to the 5th District. So I usually like to ask a lot of questions, as people know, and not try to take a lot of time. But there's one thing I want to talk about, and that's why I'm so happy everybody's here. We've talked about soybeans, big in my district, right? Certainly, right? We have talked about all kinds of issues. But in my district, you know what the big 3 are? So, not soybeans, not corn, not wheat, not rye. The big 3 are timber, believe it or not. The other one's dairy. and tobacco, right? So that's my issue. So let's talk about dairy and what the USMCA does for dairy. Fluid milk, 50,000 metric tons by year 6 of the agreement. And some of the other things, I'm going to skip the 47 things I have here, but there's something that's very, very important to my dairy farmers and the USMCA and everything that we're talking about. It's actually Class 6 and Class 7 when you're talking about actually the amount of milk and processed milk that we can actually bring into Canada. So my question here is this, and it's probably a pretty simple one. I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And if we're looking at farmers in my district, not only do we have to deal with China as soon as possible, we have got to get the USMCA passed. And a lot of that comes from me not being in politics very long. And also comes to see, I see the rising prices. And also when you talk about tariffs, you talk about steel and aluminum, I have to get aluminum totes. So really, I don't even want to ask you yes or no because you've already answered the question. But if anybody wants any of this last 30 seconds of their time to talk about the importance of USMCA or the perfect for the good, I'd like to hear it. And if not, I'm the last. As you can tell, I'm probably the last, but am I the last one? Is Cindy the last one? Am I the last one? Well, I just wanted to end easy for you all. So I wanted the USMCA. I wanted to pass. I thank you guys. Mr. Boyd, I'm going to be in touch with you, and we'll make sure it happens, whatever you need, because I represent you. Thank you, sir, and I yield back the whole 4 seconds of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Axon, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, saving the best for last. I appreciate that. And to the witnesses for being here, and a special thank you to Mr. Boyd and Mr. Russell. I'm Cindy Axney from Iowa's 3rd District, the flooded area, and of course, filled with agriculture and farming, and I know how difficult this is for all of you right now, so I appreciate everything you're doing for our country and what you do to feed the world, and I appreciate all the hard work. I come from 5 generations of Iowans. My mom grew up on a farm in my district. I know how hard it is to stay viable in these circumstances, so thank you. But I did want to talk today about tariffs and the impact on America's pocketbook. As you know, the president has repeatedly said China is paying for these tariffs, and I questioned Secretary Mnuchin here last month, and he seemed to agree with that. Mr. Bergsten, in your expertise, what research or theory could the Secretary or the President be referring to support these claims? Because I'm at a loss, and I'd like to hear from an expert.
Well, there is no theory that says that China can pay the tariffs. One does have to make a distinction how you break down the payments of the tariffs. In the first instance, they are clearly paid by the importer, the American importer. It's he or she who pays the tariff into the Treasury that the President keeps talking about. That clearly comes 100% from the American importer. The economic analysis then says, how does that change in the price of the product get disaggregated among the buyers and the sellers? Most of the theory suggests, and most of the empirical work suggests, that the great bulk of the increased tariff is paid by the consumers of the product. So, it may go through several intermediate stages, it may be a direct consumer product, but most of it's paid by the consumer. That higher price reduces demand for the product, so the exporter in China or wherever may, down the road, have to take a somewhat lower price for his or her product, and may therefore, in that indirect sense, pay some of the cost.
Okay.
But the great bulk comes on the import side and the consumer side.
I appreciate that. So, but what you're saying is that what we're experiencing right now is that the expectation is that the tariffs are passed on through additional expenses to the consumer for the price of goods.
Either higher prices for the consumer or reduction in the profits of the importer, the retailer, somebody on the import side, right?
Thank you. And then I asked the Secretary about the impact of tariffs on consumers, and he told me that he didn't believe American consumers would pay a significant price. I'd like to ask you, Ms. Baughman and Dr. Bergsten, both of your groups have estimated the impact of these tariffs on American consumers. Is that correct? Ms. Baughman, is that, I hope, Baughman, thank you. You said the cost of the average family of 4 was around $750. Is that correct?
Yes, $767 for
$767. I personally think that that's a significant price for people in my district and for Iowans to pay. I was then told by Secretary Mnuchin that his research about the costs consisted of speaking to executives of major companies. And I find that to be completely insufficient. So I sent him a letter to follow up and ask his department if they'd done any analysis on the actual cost, the impact on the existing tariffs on consumers. And although the deadline for this response was now 12 days ago, we haven't received an answer, so I'll be sending a letter today to follow up. So since your group has modeled this, my question is, do you believe the Treasury Department actually conducted analysis focused on the impact of American consumers before imposing these tariffs?
No, I do not think that they looked at that. 2/3 of the products that are on lists 1, 2, and 3 when imported from China, those are stuff used to make stuff here in the United States, raw material, parts, components. So not a lot of consumer goods. So you're not going to actually see too much impact on the price of something that you buy at Walmart from lists 1, 2, and 3. List 4, which is pending right now, 3/4 of that is consumer goods. You're going to see it when the 25% tariffs get put onto those goods. We took a look for the National Retail Federation at what the impact would be on apparel, footwear, household appliances, and toys. And in every single case, we found significant increases in consumer prices and reductions in purchases.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And so to confirm, you believe that this administration did not conduct an analysis to see what the impact would be on the American consumer?
If they did that, it's not evident.
You haven't received it either?
No.
Okay, thank you.
The chair would like to thank all of our witnesses today and for Ranking Member Hills set in admirably and powerfully and just really stood in today when when the ranking member had to leave. So without any objections, all members will have 5 legislative days in which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you can if we should send you any communication. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Unless there are any objections, this meeting is now adjourned.